could you do this to me? I know everything!
Callum Mercer had everything a man could dream of. $3 billion in the bank. A technology empire that had changed the digital landscape. A face that had graced the cover of Forbes magazine 3 times in the last 2 years. And in exactly 5 minutes, he would marry Priscilla Vanderbilt. The kind of woman who looked like she belonged in a fairy tale, with a pedigree to match. Everything was perfect. Absolutely, flawlessly perfect. But in 4 minutes and 37 seconds, Callum would see something that would tear his perfect world apart at the seams. Not a disaster. Not a protest. Not some dramatic interruption you'd see in the movies. Just a little boy running across a manicured garden. A child who would turn his face toward the sun, revealing eyes that Callum had seen every single day of his life, whenever he looked in the mirror. Grey-blue eyes. Distinctive. Unmistakable. The kind that had been passed down through 3 generations of Mercer men. Have you ever had a moment like that? When your past collides with your present so violently that everything you thought you knew suddenly feels like a lie? When you realize that the life you've been living was built on ground that was never as solid as you believed? That's what was about to happen to Callum Mercer on what should have been the happiest day of his life. Because standing near the garden gazebo, hired as the wedding singer for his ceremony, was the woman he'd never stopped loving. The one who had walked out of his life 6 years ago, taking a piece of his soul with her. Kellis Monroe, and next to her stood a 5-year-old boy with Callum's face, his eyes, his features. A living, breathing secret that had been kept from him for half a decade. A son. He had a son, and he'd had no idea. What would you do in that moment? Standing at the altar, 300 of the world's most influential people watching, your bride moments from walking down the aisle, and suddenly discovering that your entire life has been missing a chapter you never knew existed. What Callum did next shocked every single person in attendance. But to understand why he made the choice he made, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to when Callum Mercer wasn't a billionaire at all, but a struggling dreamer, sitting in a jazz club, hearing a voice that would change everything. This is a story about love and loss, about the secrets we keep to protect ourselves and how those same secrets can destroy us, about second chances that arrive at the most impossible moments, and about learning that sometimes the life we're supposed to live looks nothing like the one we planned. Welcome to Mr. Roman's Story Vault, where we don't just tell stories, we share the journeys that remind us what it truly means to be human. If you're new here, and you love stories about redemption, about real love, and about the messy, beautiful truth of second chances, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. You're going to want to be part of this community. And to my returning family, I see you, I appreciate you. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. It means everything to see this family grow. Now, let me take you to that October afternoon in Connecticut, to the Whitmore estate, to the moment when everything Callum Mercer thought he had built was about to come crashing down. The Whitmore estate had never looked more breathtaking. 17,000 square feet of architectural excellence sat nestled against the rolling Connecticut hills, its limestone facade glowing golden in the crisp October sunlight. The estate had hosted presidents, celebrities, and royalty over its 100-year history, but today it had been transformed into something that belonged on the pages of a luxury wedding magazine. The gardens stretched out like a masterpiece of careful planning and expensive taste. White roses, thousands of them, cascaded from crystal vases positioned along every aisle. Silk ribbons in champagne and ivory fluttered gently in the autumn breeze, catching the light. An archway constructed entirely of wisteria and baby's breath stood at the front, framing the spot where vows would soon be exchanged. 300 guests filled the rows of cushioned chairs, each one dressed in designer elegance. The men wore tailored suits in black and charcoal grey. The women glittered in gowns of navy, champagne and burgundy, their jewelry catching the afternoon sun. These weren't just any guests. They were America's power elite, CEOs, senators, entertainment moguls, tech giants, the kind of people whose presence at your wedding meant you'd truly arrived. At the altar, beneath that magnificent archway, stood Callum Mercer, 34 years old, self-made tech billionaire. The man who had built Mercer Tech from absolutely nothing into a company worth $3 billion. Forbes magazine had called him one of the most eligible bachelors in the country for 3 years running. Today, that title would officially end. He wore a custom Tom Ford tuxedo that fit him perfectly, every line tailored to precision. His dark hair was styled just right. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had conquered his industry, and was now about to complete the picture with the perfect wife. But if you looked closely at his face, you might have noticed something. A tension around his eyes, a distance in his expression, as though part of him was somewhere else entirely. The string quartet had already cycled through their entire repertoire twice. Vivaldi, Bach, Mozart. They were currently playing selections for the third time, the violinist exchanging glances with the cellist. The officiant, a distinguished man in his 60s who had performed ceremonies for 2 governors and a Supreme Court justice, checked his watch for the 7th time. His smile was beginning to strain at the edges. The bride was running late. Guests were growing restless, shifting in their seats, whispering behind gloved hands. Was there a problem? Was Priscilla having second thoughts? The murmur of speculation grew louder with each passing minute. Priscilla Vanderbilt was the daughter of Harrison Vanderbilt, one of the most powerful real estate developers on the East Coast. She was beautiful, accomplished, connected to every influential family that mattered. On paper, she was the perfect match for someone like Callum Mercer. The wedding was more than a union of 2 people. It was a merger of 2 empires, 2 legacies. Everything about this day was perfect, flawless, exactly what a wedding of this magnitude should be. But standing at that altar, Callum felt like he was at the edge of a cliff rather than the beginning of forever. He just didn't know why, not yet. The bride was delayed, but Callum barely noticed the restless murmuring of the crowd, because his attention had been completely captured by something else, someone else. Near the garden gazebo, about 50 feet from where he stood, a woman was adjusting a microphone stand with practiced hands. She moved with quiet confidence, checking cables, testing the sound level with a few soft taps. She was clearly one of the hired entertainers, dressed in a simple emerald gown that complemented her deep brown skin beautifully. Callum's heart stopped beating. No, it couldn't be. Kellis Monroe. 6 years. It had been 6 years since he'd last seen her face. 6 years since the night she'd walked out of their apartment with tears streaming down her face, refusing to look back no matter how many times he'd called her name. 6 years since he'd lost the only woman he had ever truly loved. She looked different now, more polished, more refined. Her natural hair was styled in elegant locks that cascaded over one shoulder, and she carried herself with a confidence that hadn't been there before. The struggling singer who worked 3 jobs had transformed into someone who looked completely at ease in a setting like this. But her eyes, those warm honey-brown eyes that had once looked at him like he was her entire universe, those hadn't changed at all. Marcus Chen, his best man, leaned closer. "Cal, you good, man? You look like you just saw a ghost." Callum couldn't respond, couldn't form words. His throat had closed completely. Marcus followed his gaze toward the gazebo, then back to Callum's face. "The singer. Do you know her?" Before Callum could answer, before he could even process what he was feeling, the string quartet shifted into the opening notes of the bridal march. The guests rose as one, turning toward the estate's French doors, but Callum's eyes stayed locked on Kellis. That's when he saw the little boy. A child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, suddenly broke free from a woman standing near the back of the guest area. He ran across the grass toward Kellis, his small legs pumping fast, completely oblivious to the ceremony that was about to begin. The child reached Kellis and tugged urgently at her emerald dress. She looked down, surprised, and immediately crouched to his level. Callum watched as she smoothed the boy's hair with gentle hands, kissed his forehead, and whispered something that made him nod. She pointed toward an older woman in the back, probably a friend who was watching him, and the boy nodded again. Then he turned. The afternoon sunlight hit his face fully, and Callum felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Grey-blue eyes. Distinctive, unmistakable Mercer eyes that had been carried by his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather. Eyes that Callum saw every morning in the mirror. The boy had his nose, his chin, that small dimple on his left cheek that appeared when he smiled. This wasn't resemblance. This wasn't coincidence. This was genetics. This was blood. This was his son. Everything Callum thought he knew about his life shattered in that single moment, scattering like broken glass across the perfect wedding he'd planned. The bridal march swelled louder, but all Callum could hear was the roaring of his own heartbeat. 8 years before the billionaire stood at that altar, Callum Mercer was just a broke 26-year-old living in a cramped Brooklyn apartment that smelled faintly of mildew and the Chinese takeout from 3 nights ago. The apartment wasn't much to look at. 400 square feet of aging hardwood floors, a bathroom where the shower only produced hot water if you turned the knob exactly, 30 degrees to the left, and a kitchen so small you couldn't open the oven door if someone was standing near the sink. The furniture was a collection of second-hand pieces, a couch he'd found on Craigslist, a desk someone had left on the curb with a free sign, a mattress on the floor because he couldn't afford a bed frame. But none of that bothered Callum. He had something more valuable than nice furniture. He had a dream. Mercer Tech was going to change everything. He knew it. The software he'd developed had the potential to revolutionize how businesses managed their data security. It was brilliant, innovative, exactly the kind of technology the market needed. The problem was convincing anyone else to believe in it. He'd maxed out 3 credit cards trying to keep the company alive. $15,000 on one, $22,000 on another. The third one he didn't even want to think about. The interest alone was eating him alive. He'd borrowed $12,000 from his father, Vincent Mercer, a proud carpenter who had built his entire life with his hands and who looked at his son's computer work like it was some kind of elaborate hobby rather than a real career. "I don't understand what you're doing, son," Vincent had said when he'd handed over the check, his weathered hands gripping it like it physically pained him to let go. "Real men build things you can see, touch, but you're my boy, so here it is. Don't make me regret this." Callum had promised he wouldn't. He was starting to think he'd broken that promise. The day everything came crashing down started like any other. Callum put on his only good suit, a navy number he'd bought at a discount store, the kind that looked decent from a distance but cheap up close, and headed to a meeting with a potential investor, Richard Lawson, venture capitalist, known for taking risks on young tech companies. Callum had practiced his pitch 50 times. He knew every number, every projection, every answer to every possible question. The meeting lasted 14 minutes. Richard had listened with a polite smile that never quite reached his eyes. When Callum finished, the man had actually laughed. Not a cruel laugh. Worse, a dismissive one. "It's cute," Richard had said, already standing up to signal the meeting was over. "But it's unrealistic. You're playing in a space with established competitors who have 10 times your resources. Come back when you have something that can actually compete." Callum left that office building and wandered the streets of Manhattan for 2 hours, questioning every choice he'd made for the past 3 years. Had he been a fool? Had he wasted his 20s chasing something that was never going to happen? Should he have listened to his father and learned a trade, something solid and dependable? At 7:30 that evening, cold and exhausted and ready to accept defeat, Callum found himself standing outside a small jazz club in Harlem called the Blue Note. He'd never been inside before, didn't even particularly like jazz, but it was warm and quiet, and he needed somewhere to sit that wasn't his depressing apartment. He pushed open the door, found a seat at the bar, and ordered the cheapest whiskey they had. He had no idea his entire life was about to change. The Blue Note was everything Callum's life wasn't in that moment. Warm, inviting, filled with the kind of atmosphere that made you believe good things were still possible in the world. The lighting was low and golden, casting everything in a soft glow that felt almost dreamlike. Small tables were scattered throughout the space, most of them occupied by couples leaning close to each other, glasses of wine catching the light. A jazz trio played on the small stage, upright bass, piano, drums, their music filling the room, with something smooth and soulful that Callum didn't recognize but immediately appreciated. He sat at the bar nursing his cheap whiskey, feeling the warmth of it spread through his chest, trying not to think about his maxed-out credit cards, or his father's disappointed face, or Richard Lawson's dismissive laugh. Then the trio finished their set, and the pianist spoke into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. We've got something special for you now. Please welcome to the stage a voice that's been blessing us every Thursday for the past 6 months, Miss Kellis Monroe." The scattered applause was polite but genuine. Then she walked onto the stage, and Callum forgot how to breathe. She was 24 years old, with skin like polished mahogany that seemed to glow under the stage lights. She wore a simple black dress that moved like water when she walked, and her natural hair was pulled back in a way that showed off the elegant lines of her face. She wasn't trying to command attention. She didn't need to. The moment she stepped up to the microphone, the entire room shifted its focus to her. She nodded to the pianist, who began playing the opening notes of a classic jazz standard. Then Kellis opened her mouth and sang. The world stopped. Her voice was rich and full and absolutely stunning. It wasn't just technically perfect, though it was that too. It was the kind of voice that reached inside your chest, wrapped itself around your heart, and held on tight. Every note carried weight. Every phrase told a story. By the second verse, Callum had completely forgotten about Richard Lawson, forgot about his failing company, forgot about every rejection and disappointment that had brought him to this bar tonight. There was only her voice, filling every broken place inside him with something that felt startlingly close to hope. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous. Kellis smiled, a genuine, slightly shy smile that made her even more beautiful, and launched into a second song. Callum stayed through her entire set, 4 songs, 22 minutes that felt like both an eternity and no time at all. When she finished and left the stage to enthusiastic applause, Callum found himself standing up before his brain caught up with what his body was doing. He caught up with her near the back hallway, just as she was accepting congratulations from an elderly couple. When they walked away, Callum cleared his throat. She turned, and up close, her eyes were even more striking. Warm, honey brown, the kind of eyes that seemed to actually see you. "That was incredible," Callum said, immediately feeling like an idiot. "Sorry, that's probably what everyone says." She studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Actually, most people say you're pretty good. Incredible is a significant upgrade." Then, they're deaf. Her laugh was rich and genuine, lighting up her whole face. "I'm Kellis. Callum, Cal. Most people call me Cal. Well, Cal, most people call me Cal. You look like you've had the kind of day that deserves a drink. Can I buy you one?" He blinked. "I was going to offer to buy you one. I'm sure you were. But you look like you need kindness from a stranger more than I do right now. Come on." She led him back to the bar, and Callum followed like a man in a trance. He had no idea that the woman he'd just met would become the love of his life, or that losing her would be the worst pain he'd ever experience. Not yet. For now, there was just this moment, this beautiful stranger offering him grace when he needed it most. Sometimes, that's how the most important people enter our lives. Not with fanfare or warning, just a simple gesture of kindness at exactly the right moment. They talked until the club closed at midnight. Kellis ordered him another whiskey. He insisted on buying her a glass of wine. They moved from the bar to one of the small tables in the corner, and the conversation flowed like they'd known each other for years instead of minutes. She told him about growing up in Baltimore, raised by her grandmother in a small row house where the heat didn't always work in winter, but the love never ran out. Her parents had struggled with addiction, first prescription pills, then heroin, and by the time Kellis was 7, her grandmother had taken her in permanently. "They died when I was 14, Kellis said, her voice steady but her eyes carrying old grief. "Overdose. Together, actually. I used to wonder if that was romantic or tragic. I still don't know. I'm sorry, Callum said, and meant it. She nodded, taking a sip of her wine. My grandmother saved my life. Literally, she worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, but she never missed a single one of my school concerts. She's the one who told me I could sing professionally, that I should chase it. Is she still in Baltimore? She is. 73 years old and still working part-time at a library because she says retirement is boring. Kellis smiled. I moved here 3 years ago with $200 and a dream. Grandmother thought I was crazy, but she also gave me her blessing, which was all I really needed. She'd been surviving in New York by working double shifts at a restaurant in Midtown, singing at any venue. That would give her stage time, and living in an apartment she shared with 3 other women in Queens. It's not glamorous, she admitted, but I'm doing what I love. That counts for something. Then she turned those warm eyes on him. What about you, Cal? Most people call me Cal. What brings a man to a jazz club on a Thursday night looking like the world just ended? And Callum did something he'd never done before. He told her the truth. All of it. The struggling startup, the maxed-out credit cards, his father's disappointment every time they spoke on the phone, the investor who had laughed at him just hours earlier, dismissing 3 years of work in less than 15 minutes. I keep wondering if I'm delusional, Callum confessed. If everyone else can see that this is never going to work, and I'm the only one still fooling myself. Kellis was quiet for a moment, studying his face with an intensity that should have made him uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. You're going to make it, she finally said, and the certainty in her voice was startling. How could you possibly know that? You just met me. I'm a singer, Cal. I've learned to read people. You have to, when you're performing. You learn to see what's real and what's performance. She leaned forward slightly. And you? You've got fire in your eyes, the kind that doesn't go out, no matter how many people try to extinguish it. Trust me, you're going to make it. Callum wanted to believe her. Maybe, for the first time in months, he actually did. They exchanged numbers that night, and what started as a friendship quickly became something neither of them had planned for, but both desperately needed. Kellis was there the morning Callum finally landed his first real investor, a smaller firm than Richard Lawson's, but they believed in the vision. She met him for celebratory pancakes at a diner in Brooklyn at 6 in the morning because he'd called her the second he got the news, too excited to wait for a reasonable hour. Callum was there when Kellis landed a recurring Friday night gig at a prestigious venue in Manhattan, tripling what she'd been making at the Blue Note. He showed up opening night with flowers he'd bought from a bodega and sat in the front row like he was watching someone perform at Carnegie Hall. The months blurred into something beautiful. Late-night phone calls that stretched until 3 in the morning, both of them too tired to keep talking, but neither wanting to hang up. Cheap takeout meals eaten on park benches, sharing dreams and fears and the kind of honesty that only comes when you find someone who actually listens, supporting each other through every small victory and every crushing setback. Callum started to realize that Kellis was becoming essential to his life in a way no one ever had been before. The first kiss happened on the rooftop of his Brooklyn apartment building on a Tuesday night in June. It wasn't planned, wasn't some grand romantic gesture. They'd gone up there because Callum's apartment was sweltering and the air conditioning had broken again. The rooftop wasn't much to look at. The access door was broken and hung crooked. On its hinges, pigeons had nested in one corner, and you could, occasionally, smell garbage from the alley below when the wind shifted. But the city stretched out around them, a million lights against the dark sky, and Kellis was standing close. Enough that Callum could smell her perfume, something light and floral that made him think of spring. "This is crazy," Kellis said softly, looking out at the skyline. "We're from completely different worlds, Cal." "Different worlds?" He turned to face her. "I'm a broke guy eating ramen 4 nights a week. You're a singer working 3 jobs just to make rent. We're from exactly the same world, Kellis. You know what I mean." He did know. The world wasn't always kind to couples who looked like them. Some people stared. Some made comments. Some assumed things that weren't true and never would be. "I don't care," Callum said. and realized he meant it completely. I don't care what anyone else thinks. I just know that when I'm with you, everything makes sense in a way it never has before. He'd never said I love you to anyone outside his family. The words had always felt too big, too significant, too risky. But standing on that rooftop with Kellis looking at him like he was someone worth seeing, the words came easily. I love you, he said. I don't care what world you're from. I just want you in mine. Tears gathered in her eyes, catching the light from the city below. I love you too, you ridiculous man. When they kissed, it was perfect. Not because the setting was romantic, it wasn't. Not because everything was easy, it wouldn't be. But because it was real, because it was them. Because sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen in the most ordinary places. This is the kind of love we all hope to find, isn't it? The kind that sees us at our lowest and loves us anyway. The kind that makes everything else feel like just noise. If you're enjoying this story, take a second to hit that like button. It truly helps others find these stories. Now, let's continue. Because this love, this beautiful, real, complicated love, is about to face its greatest test. 2 years passed, and they were the happiest of Callum's life. They moved in together after about 8 months, into a slightly bigger apartment in Brooklyn that they could actually afford when they split the rent. It wasn't luxury by any stretch. The refrigerator made a grinding noise that sounded vaguely threatening. The neighbors upstairs fought at volumes that should have required a permit. The radiator clanged like someone was hitting it with a wrench every time the heat kicked on. But it was theirs. They filled it with second-hand furniture from thrift stores and yard sales. A couch that sagged in the middle but was surprisingly comfortable. A dining table Callum had refinished himself, sanding down years of water stains to reveal decent wood underneath. Mismatched chairs, lamps from 3 different decades, framed prints they'd bought from street vendors. Nothing matched. Everything worked. The kitchen was tiny, but they learned to cook together, hip-checking each other out of the way, arguing, playfully about whether garlic should be minced or pressed, sharing tastes from the same wooden spoon. The bedroom barely fit their bed, but they didn't need much space when they spent. Most nights tangled together anyway, talking until they fell asleep mid-sentence. Their lives were growing in parallel. Mercer Tech was slowly but steadily expanding. The first investor led to a second. The second led to actual revenue. Callum hired his first 2 employees, a developer and a marketing specialist, and moved operations out of his apartment and into a small office space in Manhattan. He wasn't rich by any means, but he was finally making enough to pay down his credit cards and send his father a check to start repaying that loan. Kellis's reputation as a vocalist was spreading beyond just New York. She was getting offers to perform in other cities. A music producer had approached her about recording a demo. Her Friday night gig had turned into a Friday and Saturday slot at one of Manhattan's most respected jazz venues. They celebrated every victory together, nursed each other through every setback. On quiet Sunday mornings, they'd stay in bed late, talking about the future, in that dreamy, half-awake way that makes anything seem possible. Marriage, children, a house somewhere, nothing fancy but something with a yard maybe, and enough bedrooms for the family they'd build, growing old together, becoming the kind of couple who finished each other's sentences and held hands at 70. Callum had never wanted those things before Kellis, had never even thought about them seriously. Now he couldn't imagine wanting them with anyone else. They weren't rich. They weren't famous. By the world's standards, they didn't have much at all. Their furniture was second-hand. Their apartment was small. Date night usually meant cooking at home because restaurants were expensive. But they had everything that actually mattered. When you find someone who loves you for exactly who you are, not who you might become, not what you might achieve, but who you are right now in this moment, everything else becomes background noise. The nice apartment doesn't matter. The expensive furniture doesn't matter. What matters is coming home to someone who sees you, really sees you, and chooses you anyway. That's what they had. That's what Callum thought would last forever. But here's something true about life that we often forget. It's not the big storms that destroy us. It's not the dramatic disasters we can see coming from miles away. It's the small cracks we ignore. The little fractures we tell ourselves aren't important. The tiny breaks we don't even notice until suddenly, without warning, everything splits wide open. A crack was about to appear in the life Callum and Kellis had built, and neither of them would see it coming until it was far too late. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 years after Callum had first launched Mercer Tech. Sterling Ventures, one of Silicon Valley's most prestigious venture capital firms. They wanted to meet. Callum had heard of them, of course. Everyone in tech had. They'd backed some of the biggest success stories of the decade, companies that had gone from garages to billions in valuations. Getting a meeting with Sterling was like getting an audience with royalty. The meeting took place in their Manhattan satellite office, a gleaming space on the 42nd floor with views that made Callum's Brooklyn apartment seem like it existed on a different planet. 3 partners sat across from him. Expensive suits, confident smiles, the kind of people who were used to changing lives with a single decision. They loved Mercer Tech, loved the technology, loved Callum's vision, loved the growth trajectory. "We want to offer you $20 million for a 40% stake," the lead partner said, sliding a folder across the table. $20 million. The number was so large it didn't feel real. That was generational wealth. That was everything Callum had dreamed about when he was eating ramen and maxing out credit cards. "There are conditions, of course," the partner continued. "We'd need you to relocate to San Francisco. Full integration into our ecosystem. Board meetings, investor dinners, networking events. We're very hands-on with our portfolio companies. This isn't negotiable." Callum nodded. He could handle San Francisco. Kellis could find work anywhere. Her talent wasn't limited to New York. "And one more thing." The partner's tone shifted to something more casual, like he was mentioning the weather. "We invest in founders who project a certain image. Our investors are traditional people, old money, you understand. Your personal life is your own business, naturally, but these events, we host. The circles you'd be moving in, well, appearances matter. I'm sure you understand." Callum understood perfectly. They didn't want him bringing Kellis to their fancy parties. They wanted a founder who fit their idea of what success looked like. Someone who would make their traditional investors comfortable. Someone white, or at least someone who dated within acceptable boundaries. The realization made him physically ill. "I need some time to think about it," Callum said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "Of course, take a week. But Callum, this is the kind of opportunity that doesn't come twice. I'd hate for you to let it pass by." Callum left that office and walked 20 blocks before he could trust himself to speak. Then he called them back and turned down the offer. No hesitation, no negotiation. Kellis was worth more than $20 million, worth more than any amount of money they could offer. The investors who couldn't see that didn't deserve his company. But Callum made a mistake that would cost him everything he actually cared about. He didn't tell Kellis why he'd turned them down. He couldn't bring himself to repeat those words to her, couldn't bear to see the hurt in her eyes when she realized that even now, even in progressive, liberal New York, there were still people who looked at their relationship and saw something wrong. So when she asked about the meeting over dinner that night, excited and hopeful, he lied. "The terms weren't right," he said. "They wanted too much control. But it's fine. Other opportunities will come." She believed him. Why wouldn't she? They didn't lie to each other, except now they did. That lie, that small, protective, well-intentioned lie, would become the crack that split everything apart. Sometimes we hurt the people we love most by trying to shield them from pain. We convince ourselves that some truths are too cruel to share, that protection is the same thing as love. We're wrong. Secrets, even the ones we keep with good intentions, have a way of growing in the dark, of becoming bigger and more damaging than the truth ever would have been. Callum's secret was about to destroy everything. What Callum didn't know was that his father had been paying attention. Vincent Mercer had never fully approved of his son's relationship with Kellis. He'd never said anything directly. Vincent was too proud for open confrontation, but Callum had felt the disapproval in every strained phone call, every time he'd mentioned her name, and been met with silence. Vincent was a man of his generation, a carpenter who had built his entire life with his hands, who believed in traditional values and clear boundaries. He loved his son, wanted the best for him, but his definition of best didn't include Kellis Monroe. When Vincent heard through a business associate, Callum never found out how, that his son had turned down a $20 million investment, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He showed up at Kellis and Callum's apartment on a Thursday afternoon when he knew his son would be at work. Kellis opened the door, surprised but welcoming. "Vincent, I didn't know you were in town. Cal didn't mention—" "He doesn't know I'm here," Vincent said, his voice cold but steady. "I came to talk to you. May I come in?" She let him in, offered him coffee, tried to make small talk. Vincent didn't want coffee. "My son turned down $20 million last week," he said, getting straight to the point. "Did he tell you that?" "He mentioned a meeting that didn't work out. He said the terms weren't right. The terms were fine. Excellent, actually. He turned them down because they didn't want him bringing a black singer to their investor dinners. They wanted someone who fit a certain image, and rather than take the money and build his future, he chose you." Kellis felt her stomach drop. "I don't understand." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I need you to understand what you're costing him." Vincent's voice wasn't angry. Somehow that made it worse. $20 million now. How much next time? How many opportunities will he sacrifice before he starts to resent you for it? Cal made his own choice. He made it out of love. I don't doubt that. But love doesn't last when it comes at the cost of a man's dreams. How long do you think he'll keep choosing you over his future, Kellis? A year? 5 years? How long before he looks at you and sees everything he gave up? "You should leave," Kellis said quietly. "I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to protect my son. And maybe, if you really love him, you should ask yourself what's best for him. Not what feels good right now. What's actually best for his life." Vincent left. Kellis stood in the middle of their apartment, the space they'd filled with second-hand furniture and laughter and dreams of forever, and felt everything crack apart. Not because of Vincent's cruelty. She'd faced prejudice before, had dealt with people who disapproved of her, of who she was, of what she represented. What broke her was that Callum hadn't told her. He'd made a decision about their relationship without including her, had hidden the truth, had decided what she could and couldn't handle. In that omission, she saw the beginning of an end she'd been trying not to see. Maybe Vincent was right. Maybe love wasn't enough when it cost someone everything they'd worked for. Maybe the kindest thing she could do was leave before Callum's choices became regrets. Callum came home that evening excited about a breakthrough his development team had made. He was talking before he even got through the door, words tumbling out about code and solutions and possibilities. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw the suitcase. Kellis was packing, methodically folding clothes, placing them in the worn black suitcase she'd brought from Baltimore 3 years ago. "What's going on?" Callum asked, though his heart already knew. "Your father visited today." The excitement drained from Callum's face. "What?" "He told me about the investors, about why you really turned them down. Whatever he said. He said, you turned down $20 million because they didn't want you bringing me to their events. Is that true?" Callum couldn't speak for a moment. When he found his voice, it came out rough. "I turned them down because they were wrong, because their demands were disgusting, because I don't want to work with people like that. But you didn't tell me." Kellis stopped packing, turned to face him. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "You made a decision about our relationship without me. You decided what I could handle, what I should know. I was protecting you. From what? The truth? Cal, we're supposed to be partners. You don't get to decide alone what affects both of us. My father is a small-minded fool who doesn't speak for me. Maybe not. But he's right about one thing." Kellis's voice broke slightly. "I can't be the reason you don't achieve everything you're meant to achieve. I can't live with that weight. That's not your choice to make. Then I guess we're even." Callum moved toward her, grabbed her arm gently, desperately. "Kellis, please. I love you. I don't care about the money. I don't care about any of it. I only care about you. You should care. Tears were streaming down her face now. You should care about your future, your dreams, everything you've worked for. And one day you will care. One day you'll look at me and add up everything you sacrificed, and it'll turn into resentment. I'm just making sure I'm not around when that day comes. She pulled her arm free, picked up her suitcase, and walked toward the door. Don't do this, Callum whispered. But she was already gone. Callum stood in their apartment, their home, listening to her footsteps fade down the hallway. He didn't chase her. Pride kept him rooted. Shock, his father's voice in his head, saying, "Let her go if she wants to leave." It was the biggest mistake of his life. What Kellis didn't tell Callum, what she didn't know herself until 3 weeks later, was that she was pregnant. She'd moved back to Baltimore, back to her grandmother's small row house where she'd grown up, back to a city that felt both like home and like failure. The pregnancy test showed positive on a Tuesday morning. She stared at those 2 pink lines for 20 minutes, unable to process what they meant. A baby. Callum's baby. She picked up her phone to call him at least 100 times over the following days, 1,000 times over the following months. But fear stopped her every single time. What if he thought she was trying to trap him? Use the baby to force him back into a relationship he'd let end? What if he'd already moved on, already found someone who fit better into the life he was building? What if Vincent was right, and she really would just hold Callum back from everything he deserved? What if her child, their child, faced rejection from a father who didn't want him? She convinced herself she was making the right choice. Protecting her baby, protecting Callum, letting him build his empire without the burden of a child he hadn't planned for. She was wrong, of course, but fear has a way of whispering lies that sound like wisdom. It tells us that running is the same as protecting, that silence is the same as strength, that keeping secrets is the same as love. By the time Kellis realized her mistake, years had passed. A life had been built on that silence. A child had grown up without a father, and Callum Mercer had become a billionaire who'd never known he had a son. This is where our story splits into 2 separate paths. 2 people walking different roads, each carrying pieces of the other they couldn't let go of. But in 6 years, those paths would cross again, and everything would change. The bridal march swelled through the Whitmore estate gardens. 300 guests rose to their feet, turning expectantly toward the French doors where Priscilla Vanderbilt finally appeared. She was radiant in custom Vera Wang, her veil trailing 6 feet behind her, catching the October sunlight like captured starlight. Every detail was flawless, every step perfectly timed to the music. She looked like a vision from a luxury magazine, the kind of bride that other women would envy and try to emulate. But Callum barely saw her. His mind was trapped in a loop he couldn't escape. A son. He had a son, 5 years old. 5 years of birthdays he'd missed. First steps he'd never witnessed. First words he'd never heard. Scraped knees he hadn't bandaged. Nightmares he hadn't chased away. A whole life had been growing, learning, becoming, and Callum hadn't been there for any of it. The math was simple and devastating. Kellis would have been about 3 weeks pregnant when she left. Maybe she hadn't known yet. Or maybe she had, and that's why she'd run. Either way, she'd made a choice. To keep his son from him. To raise that boy alone. To let years pass without ever once reaching out. Part of him understood. Part of him wanted to rage. Mostly, he just felt the weight of everything he'd lost pressing down on his chest until breathing felt difficult. Near the gazebo, Kellis stood with her hands clasped in front of her, professional smile fixed in place. But even from 50 feet away, Callum could see her trembling. She'd seen him watching, had seen the moment he recognized the boy. She knew that everything was about to change. Priscilla reached the altar, her father releasing her arm with a proud smile before taking his seat. She turned to face Callum, and her expression shifted immediately from bridal radiance to concern. "What's wrong?" she whispered, her smile faltering. "Nothing," Callum lied. The word tasted bitter, just overwhelmed. It wasn't nothing. It was everything. When had this happened? When had he convinced himself that marriage was a strategic alliance instead of a partnership built on love? That selecting a wife was like selecting a business merger. Find someone with the right credentials, the right connections, the right last name, and ignore the fact that your heart felt absolutely nothing. Priscilla was beautiful, accomplished, well-connected. She checked every single box that society said a man in his position should want. But she didn't make his heart stop when she walked into a room, didn't challenge him to be better, didn't inspire him or frustrate him or make him feel truly alive. Their relationship was comfortable, convenient, safe, completely and utterly empty. He'd been settling for empty because he'd convinced himself that real love, the kind he'd had with Kellis, was a weakness he couldn't afford, a distraction from building his empire. What a fool he'd been. The officiant began speaking, his voice carrying across the garden. Traditional words about love and commitment that felt like mockery given what Callum was actually feeling. Marriage is a sacred bond, the officiant intoned, not to be entered into lightly but reverently and with full understanding of its weight and meaning. Callum understood weight. He felt it crushing him from every direction. If anyone present knows of any reason why this couple should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. The silence that followed was supposed to be brief, ceremonial, a formality that no one ever actually interrupted outside of romantic comedies. But the silence stretched. Callum's eyes found Kellis across the garden. She was looking directly at him, tears gathering in those honey-brown eyes. An entire conversation happened in that glance. 6 years of grief and loss, and what-ifs, compressed into a single moment of understanding. I never stopped loving you. I never stopped loving you either. We made terrible mistakes. We destroyed something beautiful. Can we fix this? I don't know, but I want to try. The silence continued. Guests began shifting uncomfortably, exchanging confused glances. The officiant cleared his throat softly, preparing to continue. Very well, the officiant said, relief evident in his voice. Callum, do you take... Wait. The single word cut through the garden like a knife. Every head turned. 300 influential guests stared at the groom with expressions ranging from confusion to shock to barely concealed delight at the scandal unfolding. Callum took a breath. I'm sorry. I can't do this. The words hung in the autumn air. Priscilla's face transformed in stages. Confusion first. Surely she'd misheard. Then horror, as she realized she hadn't. Then fury that turned her pale cheeks bright red. Excuse me? Her voice was low, dangerous. I can't marry you, Priscilla. I'm sorry. I should have realized this sooner. This isn't fair to you, not fair to me. Her volume was rising, shock giving way to rage. We have 300 guests, Callum. My father paid $500,000 for this wedding. The flowers alone cost more than most people make in a year, and you're telling me you can't do this? The guests were murmuring now, a wave of scandalized whispers rolling through the carefully arranged chairs. I don't love you, Callum said quietly but clearly. And you don't love me. We both know this was an arrangement more than a marriage, a merger between families. It looked perfect on paper. An arrangement that was perfectly fine until... Priscilla's eyes darted across the garden, landing on Kellis, then snapping back. Until you saw someone you used to know? The contempt in her voice was sharp enough to cut. This has nothing to do with her, Callum said, though it was a lie, and they both knew it. This has to do with me not being honest with myself, or with you. You deserve someone who actually loves you, Priscilla, not someone who's just going through the motions. How noble of you to figure that out now, at the altar, in front of everyone we know. Her hands were shaking with rage. Do you have any idea what you're doing to me? To my family? I know, and I'm sorry, truly. But I can't build a life on lies. I can't promise forever to someone when my heart isn't in it. Your heart. Priscilla's laugh was bitter. You're throwing away everything, our future, our family's alliance, every plan we've made. For what? Some wedding singer you used to date? The way she said wedding singer made it sound like an insult. I'm throwing away nothing, Callum said, his voice hardening. I'm refusing to build a life that's fundamentally dishonest." The slap came so fast he barely saw it coming. The sound echoed across the garden. Guests gasped. Someone's phone was definitely recording this. Priscilla's hand left a red mark across Callum's cheek, but she didn't look satisfied. She looked devastated beneath the fury. "My father will destroy you," she promised, her voice shaking. "Whatever you've built, whatever you think you have, he will take it all apart, piece by piece." She gathered the long train of her Vera Wang gown, turned on her expensive heels, and marched back up the aisle. Her bridesmaids scrambled after her, their carefully choreographed exit ruined by the chaos. 300 guests sat frozen, unsure whether to leave or stay or applaud the drama. Marcus appeared at Callum's elbow, his expression somewhere between concern and disbelief. "Cal, what the hell just—" But Callum was already moving. He was walking toward the gazebo, toward Kellis, toward the truth he should have demanded 6 years ago. The guests were dispersing in clusters, their scandalized whispers creating a buzz that would fuel social media for weeks. Marcus was attempting damage control, offering explanations that Callum hadn't authorized and probably wouldn't have agreed with. Harrison Vanderbilt stood near the front row, looking like he wanted to commit murder. The catering staff had stopped mid-service, holding champagne flutes and wondering if they should still set up the reception. Callum saw none of it. He walked through the chaos like a man in a dream, his focus narrowed to a single point, the gazebo. The woman standing there frozen, watching him approach with an expression that mixed hope and terror in equal measure. She hadn't run. He'd half expected her to disappear the moment the ceremony fell apart. But Kellis stood her ground, waiting. "Cal," she started as he reached her. "Is he mine?" The directness of the question made her flinch. "What?" "The boy." Callum's voice was rough, barely controlled. "The one who ran to you during the ceremony, the child with my eyes. Is he mine?" Kellis opened her mouth, closed it. Her eyes filled with tears that spilled over immediately, tracking down her cheeks and ruining her carefully applied makeup. The silence stretched between them, loaded with 6 years of secrets and grief. Then, slowly, she nodded. The simple gesture hit Callum like a physical blow. He'd known, of course. The resemblance was unmistakable. But knowing and having it confirmed were two different things entirely. "His name is Jalen," Kellis whispered. "He's 5 years old. He loves dinosaurs and hates broccoli, and he's terrified of thunderstorms. He's smart and funny and stubborn as hell." Her voice broke. "And yes, Cal, he's yours." 6 years of missing moments crashed down on Callum all at once. The weight of it buckled his knees. He sat down hard on the gazebo steps, unable to stand under the enormity of what he'd lost. "Why?" The word came out broken. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was scared." Kellis sat down beside him, maintaining careful distance. "I was 26 and pregnant and alone. My grandmother was sick. I was working myself to exhaustion just to pay her medical bills, and I kept thinking about your father's words, about how I'd hold you back, about how you'd eventually resent me, so you decided for both of us. You took away my choice. I know it was wrong. I told myself I was protecting Jalen from rejection, from growing up feeling unwanted, but mostly I was protecting myself." She wiped at her tears with shaking hands. "I was a coward, Cal, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Callum couldn't speak, couldn't process. 6 years, 5 birthdays, an entire childhood he'd never get back. "Where is he?" he finally asked. "Where's our son?" We've reached the heart of this story, friends. The moment where everything could go wrong, or finally go right. What would you do in Callum's position? Would you be able to forgive? Leave a comment below and let me know. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. We're about to see if love really does get a second chance. They walked away from the chaos together. Behind them, the Whitmore estate was a scene of high society scandal. Guests were gathering in clusters, phones out, already crafting the stories they'd tell at dinner parties for years to come. Staff members stood frozen, unsure whether to continue with the abandoned reception. Harrison Vanderbilt was loudly threatening lawsuits to anyone who would listen. But Callum and Kellis walked in the opposite direction, following a winding path through the gardens until the noise faded to a distant hum. They found a quiet bench near an old stone fountain, water trickling gently over moss-covered edges. The October sunlight filtered through the trees, casting everything in warm gold. Jalen was with Denise, Kellis's friend who had been watching him during the ceremony. They'd retreated to a quiet corner of the estate's kitchen where the catering staff, sympathetic to the chaos, had offered the little boy ice cream. For a long moment, neither Callum nor Kellis spoke. The weight of 6 years sat between them. All the things said and unsaid, all the choices made and regretted. "I need to understand," Callum finally said. His voice had shifted from the rawness of the initial revelation to something quieter, heavier. "Walk me through it. All of it. I need to know what happened after you left." Kellis stared at the fountain, watching the water fall. "When I got back to Baltimore, I was a mess. Couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. I just kept replaying everything. Your father's words, the fact that you'd hidden the investors from me, all of it." She paused. "Then, 3 weeks later, I found out I was pregnant. And you didn't call me. I picked up the phone so many times, Cal. You have no idea. But every time I started to dial, the fear would take over. I'd built this whole story in my head about what would happen. You'd think I was trying to trap you. Or you'd come back out of obligation, not love. Or your father would convince you that I'd gotten pregnant on purpose to hold you back. I would never have believed that. Maybe not, but I wasn't thinking clearly. And then my grandmother got sick. Really sick. Stage 3 cancer. I was working 3 jobs just to keep up with her medical bills. And I was pregnant. And I was alone. And every day felt like I was drowning." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through. "By the time things stabilized, a year had passed. Then too, I saw your face on magazine covers, watched your company grow from a distance. You were dating actresses and models, showing up at galas with beautiful women on your arm. And I told myself you'd moved on, that reaching out would only complicate your life. That Jalen was better off not knowing a father who might not want him. I would have wanted him," Callum said quietly. "I would have wanted both of you. I know that now. I think I always knew it. But fear doesn't listen to logic, Cal. It tells you lies that sound like protection. And by the time I saw through them, so much time had passed that telling the truth felt impossible." Callum was quiet for a long moment. "I threw myself into work after you left," he said finally. "Built the company into everything I'd dreamed of, made more money than I could ever spend, dated women who looked perfect on paper. And I was miserable. Every single day." He turned to face her. "I became exactly what my father wanted me to be. Successful, powerful, cold. I convinced myself that love was a weakness I couldn't afford. That what we'd had was just a young man's fantasy. Was it? No." The word came out rough. "It was the most real thing I've ever experienced. And losing it destroyed something in me that I've been trying to rebuild with the wrong materials ever since." The honesty hung between them. Painful, but necessary. The first real conversation they'd had in 6 years. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a beginning. Denise brought Jalen out to meet them 20 minutes later. The little boy approached cautiously, his small hand gripping Denise's fingers tightly. His grey-blue eyes, Callum's eyes, studied the stranger sitting next to his mother, with the kind of careful assessment that children often hide behind shyness. "Hey, baby," Kellis said softly, opening her arms. Jalen ran to her immediately, burying his face against her shoulder before peeking out at Callum. "This is my friend Cal," Kellis said, smoothing Jalen's hair. "The one I told you about. He wanted to meet you. Why does he keep looking at me like that?" Jalen whispered, though his whisper was loud enough for everyone to hear. Callum felt his heart crack open. "Because you remind me of someone I used to know," he said, crouching down to Jalen's level. "When I was about your age, actually." Jalen considered this. "Who? Me?" The boy's forehead wrinkled in confusion. "That doesn't make sense." "No," Callum agreed, his voice thick. "I guess it doesn't. I'm Cal, by the way. It's short for Callum, like the letter C, like California." The state. People got confused, so they shortened it. California is really big, Jalen said, his shyness starting to fade. I saw it on the map at school. Miss Peterson says it has beaches and mountains and everything. It does. Have you ever been there? No. But Mommy says we're going to go to Disneyland one day when she's not so busy. He glanced at Kellis. She's busy a lot. She sings at weddings. I know. I've heard her sing. She's really good. I help her practice sometimes. Jalen's chest puffed out slightly with pride. I know all the words to her best song, the one she always sings when she's happy, the old jazz standard, the first song Callum had ever heard her perform, that night at the Blue Note when his whole life had changed direction. That's a great song, Callum managed. It's the best one. When Mommy sings it, she sounds like an angel. I know, Callum whispered, his eyes meeting Kellis's over their son's head. She always has. Jalen smiled, a genuine, open smile that showed off the dimple on his left cheek. The same dimple Callum saw in his own mirror every morning. His son was smiling at him for the first time. It was the most beautiful thing Callum had ever seen. The months that followed weren't easy. Nothing worth having ever is. Most stories would skip ahead now, give you a quick montage of healing moments set to inspirational music, then jump to the happy ending. But I want you to understand something important. Rebuilding a family from broken pieces takes time. It takes patience. It takes the willingness to have the same painful conversations over and over until they finally stop hurting. Callum and Kellis didn't get their second chance because fate handed it to them on a silver platter. They got it because they worked for it every single day. The first thing Callum did was meet with his lawyers, not to fight for custody or establish legal claims, but to set up a trust fund for Jalen, a substantial one. Not because Kellis asked, she never would have, but because it was the right thing to do. His son would be protected financially, regardless of what happened between his parents. Then came the harder work, learning how to be a father to a 5-year-old who didn't understand why this stranger had suddenly appeared in their lives. Jalen was resistant at first, confused. He didn't understand why Mommy sometimes cried when she looked at Cal, or why everything felt different now, or why this man kept showing up at their apartment with presents and awkward questions. But children are remarkably resilient. And Callum was remarkably patient. He showed up. That was the key. He showed up consistently, reliably, without expectation. He showed up for school plays, sitting in the audience with his phone recording every moment. He showed up for scraped knees, learning that the proper treatment involved both bandages and exactly 3 minutes of sympathetic attention. He showed up for bedtime stories, discovering that Jalen had strong opinions about which dinosaur books were acceptable and which were boring. He showed up for nightmares, sitting beside his son's bed at 2 in the morning, learning that Jalen was terrified of thunderstorms and could only be calmed by someone counting slowly backward from 100. He showed up for homework help, for Saturday morning cartoons, for the mundane, everyday moments that make up an actual childhood. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, Jalen started to let him in. The relationship between Callum and Kellis was more complicated. They'd both changed in 6 years. The struggling tech developer and the aspiring singer were gone. In their place stood a billionaire with walls around his heart and a woman who had learned to survive alone. They weren't the same people who had fallen in love on that Brooklyn rooftop. They had to learn each other all over again. It wasn't a fairy tale. They argued about parenting decisions, about the past, about trust and forgiveness, and whether some wounds ever fully heal. They went to couples therapy, sitting in a neutral office week after week, saying things to each other that were uncomfortable and necessary. 6 years of hurt and misunderstanding couldn't be erased with a dramatic gesture at a wedding. It had to be worked through, conversation by conversation, apology by apology, small act of trust by small act of trust. But here's what they discovered. They were better now than they'd been before. Stronger, more honest, more intentional. They weren't falling blindly into love this time. They were choosing it, deliberately, with full knowledge of how much it could hurt if things went wrong again. And somehow, that made it more meaningful, Real love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone worth being imperfect with. Someone who sees all your flaws and scars and mistakes and decides you're worth the effort anyway. Callum and Kellis had both made terrible choices. They'd hurt each other in ways that couldn't be undone. But they'd also found something rare, a second chance. And this time, they were determined not to waste it. 1 year after the wedding that wasn't, Callum took Kellis back to where it all began. The Blue Note had changed owners twice since that night 8 years ago. The decor was updated, the lighting different, the bartender someone new. But the stage was exactly the same. The acoustics were exactly the same. The magic that filled the room when the music started, that hadn't changed at all. "Sing something," Callum said, as they settled into a corner booth. Kellis laughed. "I'm not scheduled to perform tonight. The owner owes me several favors. Please." For me, she studied his face, that face she'd fallen in love with twice now, and saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Without another word, she made her way to the stage. The sparse Tuesday night crowd quieted as she took the microphone. She sang the same jazz standard she'd performed the night they met. The song that had stopped a broken young man in his tracks and changed the course of both their lives. When the final note faded and the applause swelled, Callum was standing at the foot of the stage. In his hand was a small velvet box. "I should have done this 7 years ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have chased you out that door, called you every day until you answered, fought for us instead of letting you go." He opened the box to reveal a vintage ring with a modest stone. "This was my grandmother's. She told me once that the secret to a happy marriage isn't finding the perfect person. It's finding someone worth being imperfect with." Tears streamed down Kellis's face. "So, Kellis Monroe, will you be imperfect with me? Forever?" "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, you ridiculous, wonderful man." 6 months later, they married. Not at a grand estate with 300 influential strangers. Not with a $500,000 budget and custom designer everything. They married in a small garden in Baltimore, just a few blocks from the cemetery where Kellis's grandmother was buried. 50 guests attended, close friends, genuine family, the people who had actually shown up during the hard years when there was nothing to gain from knowing them. Jalen served as ring bearer, carrying the pillow with the kind of intense concentration usually reserved for brain surgery. He took his responsibility extremely seriously, walking down the aisle with measured steps, refusing to let anything distract him from his mission. Marcus stood as best man, the friend who had stuck by Callum through the scandal and transformation that followed. Tamara, Kellis's best friend from Baltimore, the woman who had been there when Jalen was born, and had threatened Callum with creative violence if he ever hurt Kellis again, served as maid of honor. The ceremony was simple. The vows were personal. "I promise to always tell you the truth, even when it's hard," Callum said, "to choose us every single day over any success that would cost our family, to be the father Jalen deserves and the husband you deserve, and to never let pride or fear keep me from fighting for what we have. I promise to trust you enough to share my fears instead of running from them," Kellis responded, "to let you help carry my burdens, to build a life we choose together, not one anyone else thinks we should have, and to sing at least once a week, because you insist it's good for your soul." When they kissed, Jalen made exaggerated gagging sounds that sent the entire gathering into laughter. It was perfectly imperfect. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. The house in Connecticut wasn't as grand as the Whitmore estate, but it had something that mansion never possessed: warmth. Family photos covered the walls, candid shots of birthday parties and beach vacations, not stiff professional portraits. The kitchen always smelled of something delicious, usually one of Kellis' grandmother's recipes that she'd spent years perfecting from memory. Jalen, now 11, had adjusted beautifully to having a father. He and Callum shared a passion for building things. What had started with Lego sets had evolved into robotics kits, which had evolved into the treehouse they were constructing together in the backyard. Amelia, 3 years old and named after Callum's grandmother, followed her big brother everywhere. He pretended to find this annoying. Everyone knew he secretly loved it. Callum had stepped back from Mercer Tech serving as an advisor rather than running daily operations. Together with Kellis, he'd founded a family foundation funding music education in underserved communities. Kellis still sang at weddings occasionally, the ones that felt right. She'd also recorded an album. It wasn't a commercial blockbuster, but critics loved it, and more importantly, making it had fulfilled a dream she'd carried since childhood. On this particular evening, they sat together on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "Do you ever think about that day?" Kellis asked. "The wedding that wasn't?" "Sometimes," Callum said. "Usually with gratitude." "Gratitude? If I'd gone through with it, I would have missed all this. I'd be wealthy and successful and completely miserable. Instead, I'm wealthy, moderately successful, and the happiest I've ever been." On their 10-year wedding anniversary, Callum surprised Kellis with a private concert at the Blue Note. But the real surprise came at the end of the evening. Jalen, now 16 and discovering his own musical talents, took the stage alongside his mother. Together, they performed the jazz standard that had started everything, the song that had brought two strangers together in a Harlem jazz club and changed both their lives forever. Callum sat in the audience, tears streaming freely down his face. Amelia, curled in his lap, patted his cheek with concern. "You okay, Daddy?" "I'm perfect, sweetheart. Absolutely perfect." And he meant it. Because here's what Callum and Kellis learned, what their story teaches all of us. Love is not a feeling. It's a choice you make every single day. To be honest, when lying would be easier. To stay when leaving would be safer. To fight for each other instead of against each other. They found each other twice, and the second time, they got it right. If this story touched your heart, remember this. It's never too late to reach out to someone you've lost. Never too late to tell the truth you've been hiding. Never too late to choose love over fear. Your second chance might be waiting right now, but only if you're brave enough to take it. Thank you for spending this time with me here at Mr. Roman's Story Vault. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment with your thoughts. I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join our family. Hit that bell so you never miss a story. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, choose love. Choose honesty. Choose second chances.